Pretty good afternoon so far with a lot of great information sharing, I'd say. Hopefully you would agree. Healthcare is a incredibly interesting, changing, probably one of the most unique industries without question, right? Because we deal with people, and if you consider the past few panels and the theme of the day, a lot of discussions around mobile health, e-health, virtual healthcare. Do you ever go to every conference hearing the complaints of experiential use and ability to use an EMR, which is an interesting thing when you start talking about gathering data. But today we're going to talk about, and it's always fun to be the last panel before the networking break, and everybody's anxiously awaiting to ask other questions. But we'll go through this, and hopefully you'll glean some great information. I'm going to, my name, by the way, is Mark Caron. I'm Executive Vice President at Capital Blue Cross. Our sister Blue, hi Mark, was up earlier, and great job up there. And I'm also the CEO of Geneia, which is a healthcare innovation, population health management analytics company. And today we really have a great panel, and I'll give them a few minutes to introduce who they are, the organizations they represent, the kinds of things they're working on. And so, you know, with that, and we'll have hopefully some time for questions at the end of the conversation here. So, Praveen, can you start?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Praveen Miravallede. My students affectionately call me Dr. V. Originally, I'm from India, southern India, Bangalore. I came to the US about 15 years ago, to do my master's and PhD. In my previous life, I did research in clinical hypertension. So we did flow-mediated dilation, IMTs. We used ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, masked hypertension, blood pressure variability. So why am I telling you all this? Because once I graduated, I moved on to Shippensburg University, where I received my first internal grant of $3,000. That was my R01, where the first thing that we did was purchase pedometers. If you remember, a while ago, the pedometers were huge devices that had to be worn on the hip. So we looked at employee health patterns there. I really got excited with the kind of objective data that we were getting. And then in my current life, I'm an associate professor at Penn State Berks in the Department of Kinesiology. We use a lot of wearable technology devices such as Fitbits, Apple Watches, and research-grade accelerometers such as actigraphs. We do track employee health, their physical activity patterns on campus, employees, staff, and students. We also use these devices to track their sedentary behavior. You know, how long they sit, what are the sedentary breaks they take, so on and so forth. And finally, we do validation studies. We have validated some of these instruments, the Apple Watch, Fitbits, more recently accelerometers. So my relationship with the other two panelists are Dr. Keith Diaz and I, we graduated from the same institution, same program. And now currently I collaborate heavily with Dr. Matt Rhudy from mechanical engineering.
So my name is Keith Diaz, and I am at the Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health at Columbia University Medical Center. And so our center really utilizes mobile health technologies to monitor health behaviors such as sleep, physical activity, and medication adherence. We also utilize these technologies to intervene on health outcomes such as blood pressure and glucose. And so really we come from the perspective of when we think about the doctor's office, it's not a real world environment. For many individuals, it's a rather stressful place to be. And we often take health measurements at a single point in time. And whether that's a true snapshot of what their current health status is certainly up for debate. And we often rely on, when we assess things like health behaviors or how often they're taking their medications, we rely on their cognitive ability and their recall ability. And those are limitations. And so we think these mobile health technologies actually can provide strengths and allow us to assess health behaviors, health outcomes in a person's real-world environment for rather long periods of time and capture a true snapshot of how their health behaviors are and how their health is. And so to give just one example of how we've utilized it, our center was the first to discover something I'm sure many of you have heard of, white coat hypertension. So this phenomenon where you go into a doctor's office and they take your blood pressure and it's artificially elevated. And you truly actually don't have hypertension, but they would actually go ahead and start treating it because you were in this artificial environment and probably have some anxiety about seeing a doctor in his white coat. But we have also discovered the reverse of that, something called masked hypertension. And I know I can't speak for everybody, but for myself, I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. When I go to a doctor's office, that is actually a rather zen moment for me and quite a nice environment to be in. And so if you were to take my blood pressure in the doctor's office, it's actually rather low. But if you were to take it out in the real world when I'm exposed to my everyday stressors, my blood pressure may actually be elevated. Right? And so that's what masked hypertension is. Actually, when you're exposed to the everyday things that you see, your blood pressure is actually different from what it was in the doctor's office. So we utilize these technologies because we think that we can actually deliver healthcare in a better fashion, in a better way, and see it as a strength that we need to leverage more and more.
Thank you, Keith. Matthew.
So I'm Matt Rhudy, and my background's quite a bit different than our other panelists today. I'm kind of the oddball in the group. My background is all in engineering. So I'm actually a Penn State undergrad, mechanical engineering. But then for my graduate studies, my PhD was actually in aerospace engineering. And through that work, I got involved with a research group using unmanned aircraft. And my specific area within that group was working with the sensor systems. And in particular, how do we develop algorithms and data processing to estimate and determine different quantities and coming up with unique algorithms for figuring this kind of stuff out. So a lot of my former research work is in the aerospace realm. But one of the things that happened when I started in my current position, so I'm a faculty member at Penn State Berks. This is my 5th year now working there. And so I got connected in with other researchers at my campus who were doing research with human movement and human subjects. And that's how I got connected with Praveen and the kinds of research that he was interested in. And I discovered that he's working with sensors and technology, and some of it is the same sensors that I had been using on airplanes. And so although a lot of the research I had been doing and the things were a little bit different in the aerospace realm, it was still the same kind of base technology. So I had been studying how aircraft move and behave, but when we put those same sensors on people, there's really a lot that we can learn from and kind of adapt from them. So that's how I kind of got started in this realm as an aerospace engineer working with mobile health technology. And so a lot of this kind of brings in kind of my engineering interests and expertise in the data aspect. So we get these measurements, what can we do with them? What can we calculate? And how can we come up with things that are not just what Apple and Fitbit and these products are directly giving us, but is there more that we can do with that data? Or how can we look at things differently perhaps? Or what other sensors might we be able to use that are not just the commercial packages that you're used to working with? And so that's how I kind of have evolved as a researcher, even though I'm really an aerospace engineer in training. Now I'm applying that knowledge to people.
Thank you. That's a great background as well. Mobile health is a broad topic and an area of great interest, not just for our audience, but for our country in general, and more specifically healthcare, with its potential and great promise to improve access and quality of outcome. What's interesting is if you look at definitions of mHealth, mobile health, the World Health Organization just defines it as a component of e-health. There's not really been something defined there, but I did, however, with the assistance of Google, find that the Global Observatory for e-health has defined mHealth or mobile health as medical and public health practice supported by mobile devices such as phones, patient monitoring devices, personal digital assistants, other wireless devices. mHealth involves the use and capitalization on a mobile phone's core utility of voice, short messaging service, as well as more complex functions and applications, including packet radio, third and fourth generation. This is dated, so you're probably going to have to throw 5G in there now, right? And global positioning as well as Bluetooth. So that's a pretty broad range of stuff, right? And we've talked a lot today about user experience. But more importantly for me, the question I would have is, can each of you take maybe a few minutes and talk about the kinds of things you're working on as it relates to mobile health, and maybe how it might fit in some of that definition, or maybe it won't. And then I'll come back to you with a follow-on question, and maybe we can start with Matthew down there. And
Sure. Yeah, so we've definitely explored a lot of different areas, and a lot of our focus in the types of things that we've done tries to really target the kind of prevention population. So not so much on the treatment side of, given some health condition, what do we do about it, but rather what are ways we can, try to prevent or reduce risk in different situations. And there's a lot out there, and physical activity is a huge theme, and there's a lot of research out there on just motivating people to move more and how to actually quantify, setting goals. So we definitely have done some work in that area of things like, counting steps and reaching step goals. You've probably heard the 10,000 steps a day and those kind of goals. And so that's definitely one pretty popular research topic, and there's a lot ongoing with that. There's a lot of devices that have some kind of physical activity tracking. And one of the interesting things with that is how that's been evolving over time. We really like this concept of step counting because it's nice, it's intuitive, it's simple, but we also know that people are moving in more ways than just walking and running. So we have to, with our devices, we have to develop this technology so that it can handle, oh, well, I was riding a bike. And so riding a bike, wearing something on your wrist, maybe that's not going to be counting your activity properly in terms of steps. And so there's a lot of research out there now with the idea not just of quantifying activity, but also qualifying it in terms of types of activities and also in terms of intensities. So not just how many steps did you take, but how many of those were moderate activity, vigorous activity. And there's different ways to quantify those levels also through this mobile technology. So one of our recent studies was looking at kind of keeping these categories and how to identify those different activity levels based on our measurements. And a lot of these measurements are coming through accelerometers. That's one of the most common motion sensors that you're going to see, mostly because they're very prevalent, they're everywhere, and they're cheap, they're light. Generally, they're pretty easy to implement, even within other devices. I mean, whether you're aware or not, most phones have accelerometers in them for a lot of different reasons, and so that gives it the capability for this kind of tracking. As far as other kind of recent topics and other things in that area that are still in development, one of the new interests, I've been interested in it for a while, but one of the new directions I've been working with is all related to stress. And we're all kind of aware that stress is a thing and stress is bad, but ways to quantify that are a bit more challenging. Physical activity is kind of much more developed, but how do we quantify stress? And not just in this point-to-point idea, maybe you have a cortisol test, but that gives you one point in time, and it's not giving you kind of this real-time feedback so you can identify okay, so my stress level right now is elevated because I also, like Keith, have 2 young kids, and I know my stress levels are higher at home than at work. Unlike other people, that might be a different case. But if there's ways to identify, hey, what you're doing right now is really stressing you out, maybe we can start to identify strategies of, all right, so maybe now's the time when I need to do that breathing exercise, or maybe I need to go into this meditation app on my phone. We're talking about mobile health. And being able to identify and time those kind of capabilities would be great, but I think this is still a somewhat unsolved problem, and there's definitely some efforts in this area, and this is something I'm interested in working with, something I'm currently thinking about.
That's great. I read online a couple weeks ago, this wife had a bet with her husband on the steps, who could do more steps and all that. Well, she was a runner, an avid runner, and he was a truck driver. Well, he had his watch is how he was counting his steps. Well, he would do long hauls, so every time he's making a turn, it would trigger it off. And so that brings up to a data point later, is how believable can some data be. And the other point, just as a point that I think would be really cool, when you get the stress thing figured out, let us know. I think a few of us could use that. But thank you.
So I'm an exercise physiologist by training. And so people are always surprised when they don't see that I don't have like one of those Fitbits or Apple Watches on. And I did try wearing one of these devices once, and it lasted about 3 days. Because what happened was I became obsessed with achieving my 10,000 steps for the day, to the point where I literally was circling around my apartment living room at the end of the night to make sure that I got the 10,000 steps in. And I realized that night as I'm walking around my living room that this is not for me. And you know, that kind of experience of wearing this Fitbit for 3 days and then putting it away and never using it again really led some of my research to start thinking about, are Fitbits actually helpful, or could they be potentially harmful? And really where this stems from and comes from is the fact that when we think about how do we get long-term behavior change, what type of motivation is best for long-term behavior change? And extrinsic motivation is the worst type of motivation to sustain long-term behavior change. So if I'm just constantly monitoring my steps all day and every day, and this is a constant reminder that I am inadequate and not moving enough, it creates a really negative experience that I don't want to continue, hence I didn't. And so we've really started thinking about these mobile health technologies and how do we tap into not the extrinsic motivation, but the intrinsic motivation? Experiencing pleasure when I go exercise and enjoying it, not just to reach my 10,000 steps, but actually enjoying the act and the behavior. And so our research is shifting towards how do we actually develop these technologies or rework these technologies to try to tap into the motivation that actually is going to lead to long-term change, not a couple weeks of change. So I think that's one example of what we were doing with some of the mobile health technologies is really thinking about how do we, now that we actually get people to use these things, I mean 45% of adults own a wearable device now, how do we actually make them use them for long periods of time and actually change the behaviors long term? The other thing that I'll add quickly that we're also using the mobile health technologies for is personalized medicine. So this idea that we treat the individual, and so the perfect example I'll give is my father-in-law, who has hypertension and high blood pressure, and his doctor put him on a medication that gave him a lot of side effects, and he felt really lightheaded often because his blood pressure was too low from his medication. And he just decided, I'm going to come off of my medication and I'm not going to take it. And he didn't take it for years and started suffering some of the complications from hypertension for not taking his blood pressure medication. And so that really started to lead us to think that our standards of care and our guidelines, for example, for hypertension, tell us to start with one type of specific drug class, and that should apply to everybody. But that's actually not the case. A lot of the randomized trials that are used to inform guidelines, we take the average of the entire sample of the trial. But if we were actually look at each individual person, we had some really high responders and some really low responders. The example I always use is the exercise trials that we've done, where there's some people that have a great response to the exercise, and there's some people that exercise actually has no benefit for. And I don't want people to walk away and say, oh, I don't need to exercise anymore. But what really the actuality is that person who didn't respond to exercise, they needed a different dose. Maybe that dose of exercise wasn't good enough. But we didn't look at that person. We took the average from the trial. And so what we've been trying to do is utilize these mobile health technologies to do what we call N-of-1 trials. And so the example for my father-in-law with the blood pressure is we actually gave him 5 different types of medications. And he was on each medication for 2 weeks, and we gave him a home blood pressure monitor. And we had him monitor his blood pressure every day with a home blood pressure monitor while he was taking these drugs. And we sent him text messages throughout the day, or at the end of the day, asking about what kind of side effects he was experiencing. And we used that technology to then, we compiled like a nice graphic and showed his doctor and showed him and said, here's what your blood pressure looks like with these 5 different types of drugs, and here are the side effects you reported. Now let's make an informed decision about what is the best medication for you. And that's how we're trying to use these technologies, is to actually personalize the medicine rather than just using standard guidelines or standards of care.
That's great. Praveen?
So the way we use mobile technologies is we engage employees, staff, and students. So one of the projects, most of our projects are student-driven, I should say. We have undergrad students, a really dedicated cohort of undergrad students who do a great job, phenomenal job. One project comes to mind. So we track the employee physical activity patterns throughout the day for a week. We found out that male employees take longer duration of breaks. They are more active during the break, and they spend about 25% more energy compared to the female employees. And a big part of our projects are health education. So at the end of the week, each employee is handed in a physical activity report, again, or like a lab report or a medical report. So this is a physical activity report which has their full week activity patterns with the raw data, the accelerations. So if they have exercised, they can clearly see a spike in the accelerations. And we have 2 pie charts. So one pie chart indicates the position they were in, what quantity of the time were they supine or asleep, they were sitting, standing, and the other pie chart indicates the intensity, as my colleagues talked about. Did they walk or run in light intensity, moderate, or vigorous intensity? So that is a very educational tool and very helpful. We have had positive feedback from the health education component. The other project that comes to my mind is I'm from Kinesiology, so we wanted to track the physical activity patterns of our students, Kine students. And we found out that Kinesiology students are very, very, very inactive. The average steps, the average number of steps taken per day was close to around 5,000 to 6,000. And most of the students sat up for about 6 to 8 hours. And similarly, we provided the education to the students. Hey, look, these are your activity patterns. These are your, this is the amount of time you sit. And we also noticed that on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, they are more active than Tuesdays and Thursdays. And we found out that Tuesdays and Thursdays, they have longer class times, longer class periods. So they sit a lot compared to Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. And the cool thing is they were most active on Mondays than the other days. So these are some of the educational tools. We are providing feedback to the student so that they can gain knowledge on their own physical activity patterns.
That's interesting. I'm going to bundle 2 questions into one and just ask you guys to give us a quick snapshot on that. So give us some examples of the challenges you guys have had to overcome to achieve success with your projects or initiatives. And if they weren't successful, because learning's about what doesn't work, right? What did you learn? What did your organizations or yourself or your research teams learn? And I'll start with you on the way back.
Sure. When we use technology, the biggest challenge that I think is the usage of technology itself. For example, one of the projects that we recently completed is we are using voice, that is Amazon Alexa, to influence the physical activity patterns among employees. So what we are trying to do is, we are trying to provide prompts. These could be generic prompts and specific prompts, and then personalized prompts. A good example of a generic prompt is, it's time to get up and go. And a specific prompt is, go to the fountain, nearest fountain nearby, or go to the bathroom and come back. And a personalized prompt is, Jane Doe, do this, go for a walk for a minute and come back. So while we are trying to figure this out, we noticed that the Alexa did not comply with the Wi-Fi network on campus. And we sent an email to IT, hey, our project is approved from IRB, we want to start this project, what do we do? So as usual, IT replied, we'll get back to you. So, so translation, figure it out. So my student, was quite creative and innovative. So what she did was, she tried to create a hotspot using her laptop. So the laptop was connected to the network, Wi-Fi, and the laptop had a hotspot through which we could connect the Alexa. So that is how we ran the project. So I think when we use technology, the biggest barrier sometimes can be the usage of technology, and we need to be creative enough to figure it out.
I thought you were going to beat up on the cybersecurity team there for a second.
The IRB was approved.
So I'd say one of the challenges that we have encountered is data reduction and data summary. So if you think the example I'll give is if the Fitbit collects data every minute, and if you have a person wear a Fitbit for an entire month, you're going to have 40 to 50,000 data points. And then we try to hand that to a clinician with 40 and 50,000 data points. They're going to laugh in our faces and not want to look at any of those data points and not do anything with it. And so what we have been forced to do is think about how do we reduce this data into something usable for a clinician that doesn't require more than maybe 30 seconds of their time, right? Because if it requires any type of effort from the physician to actually look through the data and come up with some type of clinical decision making, it's just not going to happen and not be implemented in. And so I'd say, we've tried to work through some strategies of the example that I'll give is we've been monitoring medication adherence. So we have these pill bottles that we can tell anytime a person opens the bottle. And what we've done is been able to auto-generate summary reports that are delivered to the physician. He doesn't get any okay, she opened it on this day and that day and that day. It just comes up with a nice summary compiled. On average, over the last month, they were adherent 60 or 70% of the time to their medication that they were prescribed. And so it's trying to work through and think through how do we distill down, these mobile health technologies are great and wonderful, but when you have such large volumes of data, how do you distill it down to something usable?
Yeah, I have a big data question later, and I think we talked about lakes and swamps a little while ago, and I think it's an interesting topic unto itself. Matt?
Yeah, I'll continue on the theme of data, but kind of look at it from a different perspective. So one of the challenges we have a lot with working with devices, so Praveen had mentioned we've run some validation studies. So yeah, we've got Fitbit and now 20 different versions of Fitbit, Apple Watch, these devices. They want to give you data, and there's some level of data access, but the access is limited to what they're willing to share with you. And so sometimes, depending on the device and how they package it, it doesn't exactly align with a certain research protocol that you want to do. So Fitbit in particular, at least at the time and what we were working with, could only give us 5-minute windows of data. So it would take, for every 5 minutes, they would tell you how many steps and how many calories in this. And so we had a 24-minute treadmill protocol that we wanted to do. So when it came to reconciling the data, it was really hard for the Fitbit data in the 5-minute intervals to break down into our 4-minute interval treadmill stages. And so trying to kind of line that up and get that to have the device data match what we wanted to see was a real challenge. So, I mean, pretty much in that scenario, what we had to do is we couldn't really break it down by stage. For Fitbit, we had just had to look at over the entire time frame of the experiment. And that can be difficult in terms of getting the data that you need in order to, in the end, we do want to reduce that data down to make some meaningful conclusions. But in order to access that data and get it and package it in a way so that we can run the analysis that we want, it can be pretty tricky. And just kind of another example of that is sometimes when you do want data, if you're using a more research grade device, we've worked a lot with ActiGraph, which is an accelerometer that, they'll give you anything and everything you want. So we can get these raw data files, and there's tons of data, and that's more a too much data situation. but then we need to figure out how to parse that into match the protocol that we're doing. And so a lot of the time what that required, at least in our case, luckily we had some very motivated and hardworking undergrads, but it was kind of a manual process of digging through, finding the numbers, copying them through to a spreadsheet. But there was a lot of manual data processing, which is just based on the nature of what access we have to the data that we're looking at.
So you kind of touch a little bit on, you know, the pros and cons of big data, right? You get all these volumes. Are any of your organizations, are you collaborating with a different part of the university? You know, we're hearing a lot about AI and machine learning, and they're really good to look through patterns and pattern recognition of data, et cetera. Are any of your organizations, are you working in any of these projects with parts of your organizations to see if some of those tools or potential tools could help you in your design and your needs?
You first. Okay. I'm actually probably the closest to this realm because in my master's work, actually, I did some work with machine learning. Now, again, completely outside of the healthcare realm. This was in working with noise detection stations around military bases. So we were developing a classifier to detect the difference between impulsive noises, which generally was they wanted to monitor when they were blowing things up, because that's what the military does. Blowing things up versus wind. If you've ever heard somebody blow on a microphone, it's really loud, right? So sorting out those different types of noise was something we pursued through machine learning algorithms to analyze the signals and detect the different patterns. So in terms of how this relates to healthcare, I mean, healthcare is a much larger set of data. We talked a lot today about how data can be stored, what access do we have, the de-identified data, and matching that up, and there's so much that can be done. I think it's one of those, you need to know what you're doing with it, because machine learning it's a tool, and it's a tool that, you know, a lot of people can use, but only a few people can do it correctly and kind of know and interpret and understand how to put the right inputs in and kind of discover what you want to find. So I think there's definitely pros and cons to this realm of kind of setting up these. A lot of times it's just like this black box model. It's I know what I have, and I have all this data, and I know what I want, and just throw it all into this magical box and let the machine learning sort it all out. And a lot of times it can actually work, but you just want to make sure that you have the confidence in what you're doing, that is actually something that you could use or apply. In terms of my experience, it's not the closest related to healthcare, but we were doing some, I also work with some of our psychology faculty members, and we're working on a project where we're using measurements of light as a way to predict basically your environment. And we're focusing on inside versus outside and the effects of that on health. And so what I was doing is developing a machine learning model to go from these raw light data measurements to predict was the person inside or outside. And that's, at least so far, been successful. It's an ongoing project, though. And then linking that to health, because there's a lot from the psychology realm that says the more you're outside, the happier you are. And we wanted more objective evidence of that and ways to use wearable technology to support those kind of claims.
Praveen, you want to add to that?
The closest that I've got to the AI is you know, our ongoing project with voice. If you can consider voice Alexa as conversational AI. So in this project, we are seeing some promising preliminary data wherein using prompts through conversational AI, we can actually influence physical activity behavior in the office. So that's the closest experience that I have. Yeah.
I'm actually hopeful and maybe a little unrealistic that conversational AI may be an answer to the EMR problem, where it's so difficult to use. Just imagine being able to talk to the thing, have the doctor be able to update a record, have it come back and give you the information. It's good to at least dream about things. But I think the technology is actually starting to evolve. And, you know, quite a few in the Blue family, quite a few of the Blues have been deploying Alexa-type solutions, very rudimentary, to the home, which is pretty interesting to start seeing there. But I think that could be a pretty cool thing. Keith, you mentioned big data a while ago, and you actually talked about personalized medicine. And as it might work in this kind of work you've been doing, how do you see the big data that you're working with, and how do you see it enhancing or providing better solutions for personalized medicine?
So I'll give an example of how we've tried to leverage it. So if we were to poll everybody in this room as to yes or no, do you exercise, and then ask them why do you do or do not, I think everyone's going to have a different answer. And so when we try to develop interventions to intervene on, you could think whatever health behavior it is, whether it's sleep or diet or exercise, it's not a one-size-fits-all. And so what we've tried to do is leverage these technologies to actually figure out, well, what is this person's specific barriers to engaging in a specific health behavior? So what we did was we had people wear a Fitbit for 6 months. And while they were wearing their Fitbit for 6 months, we sent them text messages randomly throughout the day, just asking them various questions about things like their stress levels, for example. And at the end of that 6-month period, we conducted data analysis and basically came up with like an algorithm that determined these are the reasons why you do or do not exercise on a given day. And so for one example, it would be, okay, when you're feeling very stressed at work, you tend to not exercise. We then delivered that intervention, or we then delivered that information to that person and then tailored an intervention to deal with their stress during work or work stress in an attempt to see if that could improve their exercise habits. And so I think that the opportunity to collect large volumes and large streams of data and really figure out for this specific person what drives them to engage in health behaviors has really helped us, I think, take a leap forward in how we're actually going to get people to exercise or engage in any health behavior.
Yeah, good. Where do you see the role of mHealth as it relates to personalized medicine or individualized medicine? And this is for all of you. And the only reason why I bring that up is, we talk about population health, but at the end of the day, we're really taking care of a patient, right? And trying to understand the best way to do that. And it ties in with some of the things with the senior living centers and, learning more about each other and behavior. Right? I think that's an interesting thing. And I smile about the stress thing because I can just see some of my colleagues sitting around a table in a certain stressful meeting and sending them a little happy note or something to pop up, right? That would be kind of cool to de-stress. But how do you see in the work you guys are doing and your organizations are doing, how do you see this mHealth playing a role in that?
One thing that I can think of is using this mobile technology. I have this notion what can be measured can be improved. So if we have objective data, if I know with some kind of a report, this is the amount of time I sit, this is the amount of time I stand, and these are the days that I'm most active, inactive, so on and so forth, I can do something about it. So a big part of most of our projects is education. We provide these physical activity reports that is very detailed, and an individual can personalize their behaviors and habits based on these reports. So, I think in the future you'll have more and more of these devices being connected to your car, to gadgets at home. So, and finally having some kind of an interface with an output. So, the way we interact. So I think, with these connected devices, things can be personalized.
Matt, how about yourself?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think that's all a great point. And what I kind of envision in the future as we get deeper and deeper into this, I mean, people are more and more getting tied to their cell phones and apps for pretty much anything you could want. And for those who are really invested in their health and keeping track of everything, I can really see a lot of the ideas that we've talked about really coming together. You can have this idea of personalized medicine and machine learning models and ways for, and honestly in the future, pretty much all of this could probably run just through a phone, maybe with an outside device, but through a lot of this technology, you get all this information, but if there's a way to process that in a meaningful way, specific to that person's identity and their habits and the things that they do, and we have big visions, my psychology colleagues and I have big visions too of also then integrating, you know, their social media habits. So their social activity now can really be quantified a lot through things you could access through technology. It's not just the face-to-face. There's so much done online now and through apps, and if you can start to interface all of that, you can really get a good idea of, so, and for any of these issues, if we're talking about physical activity, a smart enough artificial intelligence algorithm could identify and know exactly when and what to say or do to motivate that person to perform, to increase their activity at that moment. In this concept of stress, with the right algorithm and the right motivation, it can detect, okay, this person needs this thing right now, and then boom, on their screen, pops up, the phone buzzes, and there's a bucket of kittens. Right in the moment when the person needed it. And so whether it's stress, whether it's activity, maybe it's detecting irregular breathing or heart rate, and so there's features and there's devices for all sorts of medical conditions. Maybe we can predict, there was the former panelist talking about fall detection. You can monitor for that kind of stuff if you know there's some risks there and say, you know, hey, you know, maybe you need to sit down. We're noticing some irregular behavior. And so really, it's kind of one of those like scary thinking about the future kind of things, but the technology, it has that capability to grow and be able to really see things coming before people would, because there's a lot of information in the data, if we know how to find it and identify it, that could really help people. And again, I'm much more focused on the prevention mindset. So how do we prevent the stroke from happening, not how do we treat it after it happens? And so this mobile health technology, my vision and my goal for the future is to be able to reduce those types of things. So whether it's just everyday stress, which again can lead to all these health problems, whether it's lack of physical activity, which leads to these health problems, or just that, maybe even just early detection, like you're at a very high risk for you know, having a heart attack, so you need to go to the ER now, and by early detection, that can help save lives.
Keith, do you have any other insights that you want to
I
share?
think to Matt's point about prevention, I think what these technologies, I think if we can harness them the right way, can allow us to do large-scale behavior change. And so the example that I think is a really nice one is, so some of the health insurance companies, Humana is one of them, have developed wellness rewards programs. And so basically it's a program where like you wear your Fitbit, and for every 1,000 steps you take, you get points. And you accrue enough of those points, just like a credit card rewards program, you can redeem it for things. And so this potential to harness these technologies to actually get large-scale behavior change, and this whole, like, they're gamifying, it's a gamification, and they're incentivizing through rewards. Like, those are principles of many behavior change theories. And if we can tap into those in those ways, and I know I talked a little bit about, well, extrinsic motivation, looking at a number all the time, maybe it's not the best thing, but if we continue to develop, I think there's potential for large-scale, population-level changes in health behaviors to really lower healthcare costs.
Right. One thing we didn't, I mean, this, as I mentioned, is a broad topic, right? So we didn't really talk a lot about devices in the home that you may be monitoring other things or giving. They might be viewed as a medical device by the FDA. And I don't know how many folks have followed the FDA of late, but in 2017 they passed, you know, the new Digital Health Innovation Action Plan, and the whole purpose of that was to accelerate, you know, the ability for software vendors to get their apps through a process of certification, technology device vendors. That always used to be a really arduous task. You guys may not have touched in any of these areas, but I'm just curious, is this something your organization's looked at? Because first and foremost, like, if anybody in the audience after has, I'd like to know if in fact, and it was only 2017 and it was tied in with some modifications of the 21st Century Cures Act, so they may not be far enough down the road yet for us to have seen any agility, is probably a good word to use, in their process. But I'm just curious if anything, if your organizations have done anything with the FDA.
Closest I've gotten to that is I know in our IRB process, the Institutional Review Board, I had like custom made a device for sensing light for the psychology project I mentioned, and I know there were a lot of questions about this device of like, oh, but this thing that you've made, is it safe? Can people wear that? And I wanted to just pin this sensor box on their shirt, but because it was a device that I Frankensteined together in my office, they were a little bit leery of that. And so FDA kind of came up in that discussion. I'm like, oh man, I just want to take some light measurements with my little Arduino system. So I try to avoid FDA as much as possible. I believe
well, I think Samet's point is that the FDA slows things down so drastically that you can't do anything innovative technology-wise. It's just, it takes too long.
Yeah.
And so the wellness devices, I think, have purposefully avoided going through FDA. Aside with this new pilot program they have coming out now that's supposed to help advance this. But I think they've tried to steer clear and market themselves as wellness devices.
Right.
But your home blood pressure monitors, glucose monitors, they've had to. They have no choice because it's...
Right.
But a lot of the wellness...
Let's hope it does, right, for the sake of accelerating innovation in healthcare. Right? I think that's cool. How about yourself?
Fortunately, I have no experience.
Fortunately. Okay, I have one more question, and then I know we're running a little late, but on a few of the, I can't remember the last panel before, reimbursement came up a few times. And many sister blues are doing a lot in reimbursing for virtual care to the home, et cetera. I don't know how many folks had seen the news last week. The administration effectively signed an executive order to accelerate, to within a year propose a regulation to provide beneficiaries with improved access to providers and plans by adjusting network adequacy, et cetera. The enhanced access to both health outcomes made possible through telehealth services or other innovative technologies. That's actually pretty big because this little thing called Medicare is the biggest payer. And my career has been on both sides, right? I'm schizophrenic, I've been on the delivery system side and on the payer side. And Blues typically follow Medicare pretty closely. And I think that's really a huge thing for this country because the more we can reward and pay for those services to be delivered at a more cost-effective setting or at the home, I think it's going to continue to accelerate the innovation. So my question really is, I'm not sure how many on the panel read that article last week, and it may be a broader question to the audience, but to me, I think that this is really something that will accelerate innovation. And granted, some of the work you guys are doing today is still early, but as you would develop and adopt solutions for the home, and particularly the Medicare market, I don't know what your exposure has been to that. My purpose of putting this here really was to raise it to the audience to see how many people had seen this. Raise your hand. How many folks had seen this announcement last week? Right? So maybe it was more of me bloviating about this than it was actually asking them a question. But I really wanted to bring it to the forefront here because this will really help drive continued innovation with mobile health. And lastly, I just wanted to give you each a moment to end with any words of wisdom, insight, and keeping in mind that we're between another few questions and the networking period. Go ahead.
I read an article recently, and it stated some interesting data. The mobile subscriptions that we have right now throughout the world far exceeds the population of the world. So what that means is It's kind of interesting and scary. So people have access to mobile phone more than they have access to clean water and sanitation. So that is the level of penetration that I think mobile health is going to take place in the future. And I always believed in leaning towards the future, not running away from it. So the future is going to be, I think, in one way or the other, as somebody well said, each and every company is a technology company. It's just that they do different things. So I believe technology will play a huge role in everything that we do.
Well said. I don't have anything to add.
Matt?
Try not to get too stressed out. Take some time to relax. Yeah, just consider, always take that time for yourself. I mean, stress is a huge thing, and these days it's so common. So, something to think about, just reflect on.
I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yes?
I don't think the issue is innovation. I think that we've innovated over the last 10 years in mobile health. The issue is adoption, and the issue with adoption is proof of concept clinically and defining things. So when you have a technology that you're trying to incorporate into an electronic record, you need to define the norms. And we don't have norms for these kinds of things yet. An example is the Apple 4 watch. It can diagnose atrial fibrillation, but even experts, even cardiac rhythm experts like myself, cannot define today what the duration of atrial fibrillation is that is significant. So what happens is there are these articles saying that the Apple Watch saved my life because the diagnosed atrial fibrillation is total nonsense. So we have to define what the norms are, what the actionable thresholds are, and to then incorporate it into the electronic record in a way that artificial intelligence, if you will, or algorithms, can then alert the physician in a way in which the clinician is not deluged with a bunch of meaningless data. So there are the challenges. The challenges are not in innovation, it's adoption and analytics that are filtered and actionable for the physician.
Thank you. Any other questions? No. Yep.
Number one, Dave, when I had a beautiful front pair. Run of 3 VTAC was that you're going to die soon, which is really so common you get. We understand. So medical knowledge, you've got to really norm everything. Respond to what you said, Mark. Anybody who was at the HIMSS convention last year,
Yeah, I was there.
Who's the parents' dragon, which is speech recognition years, had a demo, and everybody's going to HIMSS this year. I know, please go to there. They had the alpha of an Alexa-driven encounter with a physician and a patient in the office that constructed the medical note and flashed on the wall behind the patient so the doctor could see the medical note that was transcribed, translating in the back and the front into posterior and anterior, translating into medical language, and then taking the quantitative data. He said, I can move your knee 20 way that way. Taking that quantitative data and putting it into the right slots into the actual agreed upon quantitative boxes. This was an alpha. It's not ready for prime time yet, but it is here.
Right.
And it was the most exciting thing I saw out of 1100. But it was the future. It will eventually get us back to being able to look at the patient. That's what's really key. To be able to interact with the patients and have Alexa and little NLP and little AI be able to get us back to the interaction that's part of the process.
Right. And if you think of some of the stuff that they've done at MIT with like Cogito and being able to listen on a phone, and through the analysis and the AI that they've got, they can tell the sentiment of you on the other end of the phone. So, and how that person should interact to get you out of the stress mode you might be in, or it really is pretty cool stuff. Any other questions? Comments? Jokes? Yeah.
For employee health, I'm just curious, have you and Matt thought that, because he's talking about the benefits of the daylight, that are your employee health to get outside and exercise in daylight healthier than the person?
Sure, we have an initiative called Walk with the Kinesiologist every day. So kinesiologist leads the walk. Most of the times I cannot attend the walk, but my colleagues do. A bunch of folks, they get together at around noonish. They start at the Lion Shrine. It's a 20-minute brisk walk. So, a blast of email is sent to all the employees. Whoever is free to attend the walk. This has been happening for the last 2 or 3 years, and it's a great initiative. So our employees do get out and see sunlight. Yeah.
Great. Anybody else? No? Yes.
As technology and healthcare professionals, what is, in your experience, our group guidelines to help someone choose global technologies, as this is an ever-changing, things are coming out all the time. What types of technologies should we be choosing, and what kind of criteria should we use?
So, I mean, I think my research nature is just I'm looking at the latest meta-analysis on the validation of whatever device it is. So it's just evidence-based, informed by what the research says, and I think it's important that it's independent of research. I think the companies are always very quick to tout how accurate they are, and I don't think this is necessarily the truth often when we test them in the laboratory. But yeah, I mean, until the FDA gets involved, I think it's a little challenging without any strict regulatory guidance. So if it is not an FDA-regulated device, then you're going to have to go by what the scientific research is showing us. That's the best I can tell you.
Probably.
Yeah, I think the rule, in my Geneia company, we developed a remote patient monitoring platform using a biopatch. And we were concerned about that because devices change quickly and the sensitivity and all that stuff. So to me, it's right to an API level if you're writing an application and making it agnostic to the device so that as devices evolve, you can still use that application and enhance the application. We did this, it's 2019, in 2016, and we've gone through 2 device upgrades from different vendors even. But the application still works.
And I just want to add something.
Yep.
For some of our research, we validate our own instruments. I know Keith, you validated, Keith's group was one of the first groups to validate Fitbit when it came out to look at the accuracy of the steps. And we wanted to use Apple Watch. We Googled, there was no validation studies on Apple Watch. So, we performed our own validation studies. So we believed, what we saw and we use it. So we do our own validation studies and it's published.
Anything? Anyway, I think there was one more question up here.
Yeah, quick question. I read reports that going forward, or even historically, that 80% of health outcomes are from social determinants.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we have this huge infrastructure based on the other 20%, patients in front of the doctor, and with the risk to be mitigated of these new agents. And there's not a lot of fields to map to in the EMRs to capture all that other 80%. Is this bridge going to happen? What's the timeline of all this? It seems to be so much more overwhelming work to be done.
Yeah, I know. I'll answer this from the care management payer side. My Geneia company also manages about 1 million lives, so we're a delegated entity. We actually have applications to capture that information, and we're using it in some of our early models. At a minimum, you start identifying transportation needs, deserts of food, et cetera, but being able to understand some of those economic issues and tying it for outreach and how to outreach. So the care management organizations are starting to use that, and I've talked to several EMR vendors, and they are starting to enhance their EMRs to capture that information as well. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Sorry, is there research going on in that? You're live and doing the uptake there.
Well, I mean, anytime you understand more about a member patient and what their challenges are, then you know, and you know, language, right? You know you have to put care. There's different cultures. You might put a clinic right in a certain neighborhood because they're just used to going to a clinic in that neighborhood. And right now what we're seeing is the earlier we get contact and outreach and engagement with any type of member patient and identify risk factors sooner, then we can engage them in various wellness programs, you know, prevention, diabetic prevention programs. That information you really can glean out of those social determinants.
Okay, so let's thank our panelists for a great presentation.